So I'd like to welcome everybody to this conversation between Himali, Alexis and Jason, responding to the exhibition at Orleans House Gallery, Brow of a God, Jaw of a Devil, a beautiful, interactive, immersive exhibition that fills the gallery with ideas of the river Nile and its huge cultural power, and around a certain gentleman, a certain Sir Richard Burton. But we're here to talk more, I think, about the cultural heritage of rivers, what they mean to society today, and what might come next about rivers generally, but obviously our relationship with the Thames alongside Orleans House Gallery, given who we are. So I'm going to hand over to our three experts, three protagonists, talk about what they do, and then we can continue with a conversation from there. So I'm going to start with Himali. Very good to see you.
Thanks, Andy. Hi, I am Himali Singh Soin, and I am an artist and writer based in London and New Delhi. And I conceived of Brow for God, Jaw for Devil with Alexis Rider, and we met together on a boat in the Arctic Circle. And the exhibition loosely, the title refers to Richard Burton, who was said to have a brow of a god and a jaw of a devil. And his one particular book called The Search of the Nile. And we thought perhaps the brow and the jaw also refers to the source and the mouth of the river itself. And we began to think of the river as an archive and the river as a source of information that is constantly shifting and moving, and histories that are changeable, and what that might mean for the present landscape in which it is situated, and that is the Thames and its own future.
Alexis, do you want to?
Sure. Hi, my name is Alexis Rider. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia in the history of science. I'm a historian of science and an environmental historian. My work is focused mainly on the cryosphere, but I'm interested in all things hydrosphere also, even considering how those two things are separated. As Himali said, we met in the Arctic, and for Brow of a God, Jaw of a Devil, I did the kind of archival researching into the collection that is held at Orleans House, which is Richard Burton's collection, which is kind of material and also ephemera. So it was a very interesting and rich kind of visual and textual place for us to be looking. And obviously Burton was an extremely complex Victorian colonial figure, celebrated by many, maligned by some. And one of his big obsessions was finding the source of the Nile in the 19th century. It was the cause of a huge feud between him and other explorers who thought they had found the source and he hadn't. And so we were really intrigued by how this river could be understood both as a way of interrogating histories of colonialism, histories of exploration, histories of environmental change, and could also be kind of a metaphor and a way of thinking about the kind of environmental situation or crisis that we find ourselves in now, which is not bound only to the Nile River, but can be traced across rivers throughout the world and beyond rivers. So we were also trying to think about the Thames as part of this story. So yeah, I'll pass over to Jason.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jason. I run an organisation called the Thames Landscape Strategy, and we look after a stretch of the Thames called the Arcadian Thames, which reaches from Hampton Court at the upstream and down in the freshwater river, down through to the tidal Thames, finishing around Kew Gardens, that area. It's an incredible stretch of river that's full of historic parks and houses and walks and avenues. I suppose where we come into this one is that we're looking at how the river is going to change and how we can manage that change in the future. based mainly on climate change. And we have a project called Rewild in Arcadia, which is looking at how we can refocus the floodplains along this stretch of the river. I'll give you an example. When we look at a floodplain along the Arcadian Thames, I would say that pretty much with 100% certainty, that floodplain is managed as a dry environment. It's a dry place, but it should be wet. So how can we explain that to people as climate change accelerates? That dry place is going to turn increasingly into a wet place. And we need to explore over the next couple of years how we can increase the understanding about that fundamental change that's come into it, to the floodplain.
Good question.
Sorry.
I think that's a very good question. How can we do that? Do you feel like Brow of God introduces some of those thoughts, Himali? Do you think that in some of the text that's been written, it kind of speaks to so much of what we don't understand, the mysticism of Nile, particularly, but rivers generally, but how much they are part of our practical society as much as any kind of more mythological or everything else kind of parts of our society.
Yeah, in a way, Jason, just before this, when we looked at images, and there was one particular image that you liked, it was this kind of green, bright fluorescent green wash of vegetation over this another image. That was referring to what we discovered as the sud in the Nile, which is a piece of vegetation that begins to grow across the river, across the breadth of the river, and makes it unnavigable. And in a sense, we were really drawn to this idea that this vegetation was possibly a natural decolonial agency, and it allowed the river to remain illegible in a way and protect itself from being conquered or extracted from, right? And now this vegetation that you're speaking to kind of also seems reminiscent of that. But also these measures that we've taken even to tell this story have these layers of artificiality and fiction. Do you think that rewilding is possibly introducing a fiction into the landscape that doesn't exist?
I think it's doing the opposite, if I'm honest. It's interesting to hear what you said about conquering the river, as that's something we thought that we'd done on the Thames. We thought we conquered the river. We thought we had fixed flooding when we built the Thames barrier back in the 1980s, when we put the river flood defences up. That was it. That was us having controlled the river. But the river is now telling us that it wants its floodplain back. It's the river that is the prime motivation that's doing this, because it's the river that's changing. And we've had to catch up with what nature is telling us. And rather than trying to constantly control the river now, we are looking at it in a totally different way. And we want to work with the river and how the river is changing its landscape. So I think it's not us trying to impose a fiction on it. I really do think it's the opposite. We've learned a lot about constantly trying to control a river doesn't work. And I think of some of the rivers in the States, and where Alexis is, I've been to Richmond, Virginia a lot and had a look at the James through there and tried to see how they've tried to control the flooding in that river, and it disconnects people from the very thing that they're trying to celebrate, and secondly, it doesn't work. So trying to introduce this control is not a way forward.
I'll add that it's not the first time that people have tried to have had that problem with the Thames, right? In the 19th century, when all the bridges were first being built across it, huge silt piles were being produced by the tidal flow, bringing all of this like sediment in, and it would pile up around the pylons and create one of the most dangerously difficult bodies of water to navigate at the peak of this kind of naval moment for the UK, where ships and trade was so important. It was just a complete chaos producer because of putting these kind of, like, if you want a blunt metaphor, there it is, humans putting literal bridges across a thing and completely creating chaos. But yeah, I think it's interesting to think about the ways that we see understanding of the human and non-human or human environmental relationship. Every moment in time, people think that they do understand that relationship, right? So it's interesting to think that, so for the US, a great example, the Mississippi is another incredible example of these attempts to control a river that is demandingly changing, but people think you can go in and send the military in to build dams or whatever you want. But they imagine this as being the correct human, non-human relationship, right? And then there's a shift to this kind of ecological thinking of cycles, and you can't think of a one-to-one relationality. But it is just a very interesting kind of pattern of how humans grapple with this kind of tension between being social or natural, and how we understand those kinds of binaries and boundaries. So it's just very interesting to hear about rewilding being this very good new iteration of that, but filled with these same kinds of questions of how to manage when we're at such a dominant species.
I think you're quite right, and I think the most important word you used there was control. I think as a human being, it is something which is very deep inside us, is wanting to control nature, and that's where I love the even the phrase "rewild in Arcadia," as Arcadia was a natural rural paradise, but it was a paradise that was created and controlled by humans. And so even the very name "Rewild in Arcadia," to me, it has all of those different stories and layers in it, that we're taking something which is meant to be a paradise, and it's meant to be a paradise that is controlled and being created by humans, but we're saying, no, let nature dictate what's going on. And I think that's going to be a very difficult thing to do, as the floodplains that we're looking at are in London, and so they're in the largest metropolis in Europe. And most people, when they come down and they walk along the river in Richmond or Twickenham or wherever it is, they'll look at that, the wildlife, they'll look at the landscape that they're walking through, and they will think it is a very natural landscape. I would imagine that most people would say that it is somewhere that humans have had a very slight hand in, but there's nowhere, almost nowhere, in this part of the world which has not been created at some point, usually in the last 200 or 300 years, by a human. Even the height of the river, as you alluded to, the tidal limit of the river has fluctuated on the Thames by up to 20 miles over the last 300 years. It used to go right the way up to Staines. At one point, you mentioned these pylons on the bridges, the old London Bridge. I say the old London Bridge, it was the old London Bridge. That used to stop the tidal water coming up, and that was it, that was the tideway, and they knocked the bridge down and put the new one up, and almost overnight the tide came tens of miles further upstream. So it's constantly changing, constantly evolving, but there's one thing that is constant on this, and that is the river. And it's the river that constantly is saying, no, this is what I'm going to do. And it doesn't matter how much we try and control that, eventually that river's going to win.
I was just at the Salton Sea in California, which is created by the diversion of the Colorado River. And it stank because it's evaporated so fast that it's become so saline that no fish can live there anymore. And the birds are just dying, eating the few tilapia left. And it was this kind of totally beautiful vision or like portal into the catastrophe that is waiting for us.
What are they thinking of doing there? Do they have a solution? Because I imagine that's going to be blowing up quite a few dams or something. There's
no way they're going to do anything, because the LA needs the water. I mean, water rights in the United States are very complicated, but let's just say LA needs that water. It's not going to divert it to save a lake in the middle of like 3 hours from Palm Springs. LA needs it. And orange groves and all the food that is growing in California. So again,
sorry, I was just going to say, speaking of orange groves and this desire for water too, this was another theme that we explored. I feel like we underexplored it because we wanted to kind of give the river and some of the Burton research the most light, but Burton as a figure translated the Kama Sutra, which interested me quite a lot. And he had these very like erotic leanings. And often it would come up in our conversations that the river is related to pleasure. And the river has this kind of eroticism to it. So when you're saying that we listen to the river, I wonder if you've ever thought how we can activate the pleasure center of the river to return it to ourselves somehow. Like, how do we reimagine the river?
Oh, good grief! Are you asking me? I've often thought about the river as a thing for pleasure, but I can't say I've ever linked it to the Kama Sutra. It's not the Thames anyway. That's a totally new one on me. I don't know. It's the river always has been there for pleasure. If you look at the different layers of the Thames, it went through being a working river. It then went through being a river of privilege. And Arcadia was somewhere where the good and the great and the elite would have their villas. The ordinary people weren't allowed there unless they were working on it. And the river was a pretty grim place. Upstream and downstream of Arcadia were the industrial areas of Kingston and Staines and London. The reason why people came and built their houses and parks along the river here was that it was a pleasurable place. It was to the west of London, so they couldn't smell London and the stink of London. So they did have their pleasures here. And then I suppose it was around the Victorian time that this privileged landscape was opened up for the ordinary people to enjoy. And bit by bit, all of these wonderful enclosed parks and gardens and estates along the river, be it Kew Gardens, Hampton Court, Orleans House, Richmond Park, whatever, the people fought for these places to be opened up and given over to the public. Then they fought for them not to be built on, and they have fought for them ever since, because that interaction between the enjoyment they get out of these spaces is so strong. And so I think it has been a landscape of pleasure for a long time. I don't know if Alexis has any more she could give to that.
I would just say that one thing that in terms of giving the river back and giving the river pleasure, there is obviously it's a different situation when it's the Thames, but in somewhere like Aotearoa, New Zealand, increasingly rivers are being assigned human rights. So there is the Waikato is now considered a living human being, protected as in the ways that a human would be given rights and protection, which of course involves giving indigenous sovereignty and kind of control or management to the people who have been living with this river far longer than the kind of settler colonial framework which has been doing river management in that country, in my country, right? So that is one example of these ways that really thinking about giving a river sentience or some sort of like presence is kind of thinking in a completely different kind of environmental and ecological framework, which is removed from this kind of state-centered downwards control or even dictation of whether it's natural, whether it's protected, how to think of it, and just saying this is actually a living thing with all of its pieces. But then of course the debate, Jason, you'll be fascinated to know, was where does the river end and where does the river, is it the water? Is it the land around the water? Like how do we how do we draw a barrier around which we can say, this is the object, this is where it ends, and this is where it begins, which is again this question of conceptions of nature and conceptions of beginnings and ends and systems versus objects, that is super interesting in terms of the climate crisis is evidence of this every single day, right? Feedback loops and ways of the ways nature interacts and has balances or doesn't have balances is not this kind of fantasy of Mother Nature having a self that we can all just rely on.
And Alexis, we've talked about silt as this very interesting space between water and land that also kind of challenges property developers because it's difficult to actually build on that, but it's this constantly like morphing state. But interestingly, I want to say that in India, the Ganges River, which already has and is so deeply steeped in Hinduism that it already has like immediately sacred connotations, they tried to give it personhood too. And they actually decided not to in the end because it wouldn't be eligible for foreign aid to be cleaned up, because a single individual cannot receive that aid. So there's so many different versions of that.
Yeah, I wanted to just talk a little bit about where art sits, that nebulous term art sits, kind of in helping to kind of really explore all of these things that you just talked about, things that from a very functional, practical Western mind kind of can feel like flights of fancy or feel like a kind of a space that is so alien to them, but feels so present and so important, and particularly to the Thames, which this part of the Thames again has been documented or like imagined by so many artists and is one of the reasons why it became protected. So how art can help with this rewilding wherever needs to be rewilded, and how those kind of experiences can support all of this.
Well, I could jump in quickly. I think the first thing to say about that is that the river itself, we've always seen as a piece of art. And when anyone is designing, whether it's a park along the river or a piece of streetscape, a town centre, whatever, we always try and say that it should not draw attention from the river. And the eye should constantly be drawn to the river. And when I think about some of the great pieces of art of the river, it's always the landscape which focuses that piece of art. And where it fails is when people try and over-design the river, and that comes back, I suppose, to something we talked about earlier, that control aspect. They're not letting the natural process of what we're looking at, of a dynamic, constantly evolving thin, which is what a river in its floodplain is. If that's not given the free rein to do what it wants, then we're trying to control the very thing that we're trying to capture in that art. So it's a difficult one, and I'm thinking of some of the things that we've, again, going back to Richmond, Virginia, and going there with some of the indigenous tribes there. And I've been out in the Chickahominy and River, for example, and learned a lot from, say, some of the Native American Indian tribes down there and how they think about the river and their particular stretches of the river and what they are hoping to achieve with the rivers and how they express the river within their art. And it's almost ephemeral. I remember going up and we looked at Powhatan's mantle at the Ashmolean Museum with 2 or 3 different Native American tribes from Virginia. And we asked about how they felt about the mantle being at the Ashmolean, and it didn't seem to worry them that much, because he said that art to them was something which, once it had gone, it had gone. It wasn't something that was meant to be permanent, because it celebrated the natural world, and the natural world isn't permanent. It's constantly moving on. And so he didn't see that as a problem, because the mantle was there. It's something which our culture looks at as, we like that permanence, but it wasn't something that worried them. And that's the river. There's that wonderful song. It's a very cheesy song. Old Father Thames keeps rolling along down to the mighty sea, and it is a very cheesy song, usually sung by very large blokes, but it is a song that does sum up the river, and it does keep flowing. It keeps changing. It changes around every corner. It changes every second of the day, and that is where I'd like to see the arts trying to understand and interpret that.
Alexis, you should definitely tell us about the children's project after this, because I think it engages in the learning aspect of art in a really interesting way. But I would just say more conceptually, and again, returning and thinking about India's rivers, I think there's only one river that is a he. Otherwise, all rivers are either not gendered or she. And that is already interesting, just to think of like a feminine way of being as well with the river. But where art comes in for me, and thinking about water, of course, is it's, as you said, it's constant impermanence and it's change, but it's revealing to us the non-linearity of time. And that's where I think the arts can enter into climate change discourse, is to understand that there is a thing that is deep time, and to understand the very intensely accelerated time that is the time of of capital and industry. And to understand that these two times coming together means like a deep collapse of something, and then an opportunity for regeneration. So the river becomes this kind of palette through which we can start to think about time itself.
Sorry, Alexa, I was just going to jump in there, because we talked earlier about the Nileometer with Richard Burton, and that's all about time. It was about measuring the flood. It was a known flood that was going to come down the Nile. And from ancient times, they knew this flood was going to come down. And it's the same with the tides on the Thames. We can predict the tide and the height of the tide on the Thames for centuries to come, because of the phases of the moon. We know exactly what time it's going to come, but we can't say exactly how high it's going to be, because so many other factors come into it, be it wind direction or whatever. And so even there, the river is still trying to catch us out. Sorry, Alexa, just thought I'd jump in there.
No, that's really nice. And I also obviously work on glaciation and the ice ages, and that is just a bigger version of exactly what you're talking about, this anxiety of, I mean, when the concept of the ice ages became widely accepted, it produced huge anxiety around the potential for the ice to return, right? It's like the biggest river and the most dangerous river that's going to come and subsume centers of quote unquote civilization. So it's interesting to hear you talking about that. I would just say that I'm a historian and I teach history, and my aim when I teach history is to try and make the present, the normalcy of the present, seem strange and interesting. And I think that art is trying to do the exact same thing with these questions of the environment and questions of looking at a river and thinking, pausing and having a different moment of reflection and engagement with it, that is not just this kind of world that you've existed in and had such a clear kind of ontological position in for your entire life, to take a moment and have this second of thinking how and why, basically. And I think art is a really powerful way to get people to think and do that. And I think that's definitely what we were trying to do in Brow of a God, Jaw of a Devil, is have people think not just about the river, but also about archives and history, and the way that these understandings of the past and change and agency can be complicated and are complicated, and there's not just one single story or narrative to be had.
Could you take that further, and you could use art to increase understanding about the future and how the river's going to change, how the river could change, how do we want the river to change? what can we do about the change in river, be that floods, increase in flood risk, increase in risk of drought, however climate change takes us. Art can be used as a way to increase understanding amongst so many different people about how with the Thames, how that could change. And that really fascinates me, because I can stand up and talk to people all day long and give a quite technical talk about this is flood risk, it's going to change like this, we could do this. But a piece of art can do that and make people actually think about it in a way that somebody like me can never do it.
Yeah, most definitely. Well, definitely come down and see Brow of a God, Jaw of a Devil, everybody. Wherever you are, when you can, and take it through time, and all the other myriad of places that it goes. It's an incredible show. I want to say thank you to the three of you for joining me here on Zoomland, and I hope to see you all very soon. And we'll share this very soon. And if everybody out there has any questions, do ask them in the chat, or send them through to us here at Orleans House Gallery, and we will get them through to the people and have some answers to all of the amazing things that we've been discussing. So thank you very much, Himali, Alexis, and Jason, and thank you everyone for joining us.
Thank you.